Hello everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame, where we delve deeper into the top stories not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. In January, South Korea suffered its largest ever monthly trade deficit at 12.69 billion US dollars. That was largely due to sluggish outbound shipments, which saw their fourth on-year decline in a row. The fall in exports was widely blamed on dropping overseas sales of semiconductors affected by sluggish demand and falling prices. As one of Korea's key export items, what challenges does the chip industry face? How should companies deal with them, and how should the Korean government support chip makers? For an in-depth analysis of South Korea's trade sector and the challenges the South Korean chip industry is facing, we invited Song Soo-young, professor of business and economics at Chung-Ang University. Professor Song, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, and good evening to you.
All right, good evening. And we also have Andy Mok, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, joining live from Cambridge through Skype. Andy, welcome. Thank you so much for your time.
Great to be here with you.
All right, Professor Song, first question to you. In January, South Korea's trade deficit reached an all-time monthly high. The Trade Ministry says it is mainly due to faltering outbound shipments as they fell 16.6% on year, coming in at 46.27 billion US dollars. What's behind export difficulties?
Basically, as the Minister of Planning has explained, that this has maybe the seasonal effect plays a role. But however, what I'm most concerned is the trend, the outlook of the prospect of the trade deficit and suffering of a reduction of the trade is not prospering, is not good at all, because that is the main reason why the IMF has revised their forecast of the economic growth rate for the Korean economy, mainly from the 2% and reduced to 1.7%. Some other institutions such as Asian Development Bank even lower than that, 1.5%, and the Bank of Korea also forecast 1.6%. So the main reason is because the trade and the export is a primary, one of the primary device for the Korean economy to recover or its own economy. So that's why this trend is, even though it is claimed to be some seasonal factor plays a role, but what I'm most concerned is maybe we may lose because of this sputtering economic growth of the China, and particularly we do not have currently good relationship with China and Korea politically and diplomatically. So other than economic factors, that plays a certain role. So that is why we have some gloomy prospect for the upcoming years.
Right. So although some say it could be seasonal, you're quite worried about the downward trend of the exports right now. Now, how does sluggish trade affect the overall economy? Could you elaborate more to our viewers, Professor Song?
Yeah, particularly the percentage of the net exports, so the difference between the export and the import, is not just 3 or 4% of recently, because our domestic economy has grown very large. But however, the export itself almost accounts for more than 30% of our GDP. It means it provides some job opportunity and the income to the potential consumers. Of course, the import side also creates some job opportunity for the domestic consumers in Korean economy. So that means the reduction of the trade and the reduction of export and import implies that the consumption could be revised downward. So declining of consumption. So it means that some growth engine is declining. That is my primary concern about some recent increase of the trade deficit, as well as a reduction of all the exports and imports.
Right, so it could have a negative effect on jobs and incomes and eventually to the consumption area.
That's right.
Right. Now, to get a better understanding of the situation, I would like to focus on chips, one of the country's key export items and among the hardest hit. Now, Andy, semiconductor exports dropped to $6 billion US, which is down 44.5% on year. And one of many reasons is weaker chip prices. Is the price usually volatile, and why the falling prices?
Well, indeed, the prices of semiconductors are very, very volatile. And there's a number of reasons for this, but I think one of the most important and interesting ones is that manufacturing semiconductors requires large investments, 10 billion US dollars, 15 billion US dollars, sometimes even 20 billion. And they take a long time. So, and it requires highly specialized equipment as well. So what this means is that the semiconductor manufacturers, whether you're a Samsung, you're a TSMC, you're an Intel, is that once you've made these investments, you can't really get out of them. So you're trapped in this cage match. So you're fighting to the death with no way out. So when demand goes down, everyone has a very, very strong desire to sell because on the one hand, it's very expensive to invest in chip making, but the cost of the chips themselves are relatively cheap. So when times are good and demand is up, these companies are very, very profitable. But on the other hand, when demand goes down, you see vicious price competition. And I think this is exactly what we're witnessing today.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Song, another reason for weakened chip exports is reportedly sluggish exports to China. Why so sluggish, and how dependent are we on the Chinese market?
Primarily, the Chinese market is currently suffered from some declining growth rate of the economy. And the prospect, as long as the U.S. and the Chinese two countries conflict of trade and some political issues has been resolved, and then as long as it turns out to be a smooth recovery of the relationship between the U.S. and China, that the prospect of the economy is quite good. But however, currently, as it is shown in some recent episode and occurrences between the two countries, the prospect is a little bit gloomy. And further, the Chinese economy has suffered from the outbreak and the return of the coronavirus. So that is my main concern. And for the Korean economy, actually, Korean exports in electronic equipment almost takes 31%. Out of that, according to the country, China imports 26% of the Korean electric and electronic equipment. US 16%, Vietnam 9.2%, Hong Kong 66%. So that has explained almost 32% of the electrical equipment export has taken by the China and Hong Kong. So to that regard, as long as China shut down all the import of Korean electronics or the chips and other things, then Korean economy cannot but suffer from the declining of export and also declining GDP. So that is why the IMF has reduced some prospect of Korean economy. Rather, all over the country or around the world, actually, the IMF has increased their prospect on the economic growth rate for the rest of the world is much better. So that tells us what is the problem and what was some difficulties lies ahead in Korean economy right now.
Right. Now, Andy, to the world's two largest memory chip makers, Samsung and SK Hynix, China, like our Professor Song said, China is not a country that can be easily neglected because we are heavily relying on the country. However, Washington's attempt to keep China in check with CHIPS and Science Act is making South Korean chip makers quite struggle. And both chip makers are reportedly requesting for a waiver and grace period, which would exempt them from the rule. I wonder, what should South Korea's chipmakers' survival strategy be?
Well, you're right that these companies, Samsung, SK Hynix, others, are facing an enormously difficult time. But I think it's important to point out that China, of course, is an important and growing market, an end user market. But a lot of semiconductors are inputs into goods that are sold around the world. So I think that we have to see the macroeconomic conditions here, that if the world does pick up, I think certainly exports from South Korea to China will improve. In terms of what can these companies do, I think, unfortunately, they are like Huawei, other Chinese companies, the victim of this geopolitical tension, this geopolitical conflict. And perhaps the best course of action is just to hunker down and survive and wait it out. Because I think there's little question that as China's economy continues to grow, as its technologies continue to advance, that these problems, they're like a storm, will end, and hopefully sooner rather than later. And when it is over, I do believe that the companies that can weather this storm will face bright days in China and through China to sell their products to the rest of the world.
Right, so South Korean chip makers have to wait until the storm goes away. Now, let's dig deeper into the details to see what needs to be done for South Korea's chip industry to lead the global chip market. And why don't we discuss the non-memory chip market, where South Korea is slightly struggling a bit. Now, Andy, in global foundry production, South Korea is seeing quite a gap in market share compared to TSMC of Taiwan. I wonder what the main reason is for this gap, and what is TSMC's strength that made such a wide gap possible?
So the problem is Squid Games. Here I'm joking, but what I think that Korea has such great cultural power that workers have many, many alternatives to working. But of course, I'm just joking here. I think the answer is, to a degree, though, cultural. If we look at TSMC, its founder, Morris Chang, although of Chinese ancestry, was trained, really shaped in the United States and very much influenced by American technology, Silicon Valley values, as were a number of the key executives at TSMC. And I think this culture plays a role. A second factor we can consider is that TSMC only does one thing, whereas we see the semiconductor units of companies like Samsung are part of a Jabil. And as a result, they may not always be able to act to maximize the strategic advantages or the economic interest of their particular unit, because they are part of a larger entity. So I think these are some factors that may account for this discrepancy, or why TSMC has such a leadership position in certain sectors of the semiconductor industry, especially the advanced chips, as you mentioned. And it's not just with Korea, but we look at any company around the world. The American companies as well are behind TSMC. So certainly, I would look not only at the technological aspects, but perhaps some of the cultural elements as well.
Right. It's really interesting how you brought up the cultural aspect of such a widening gap. Now, Professor Song, though South Korea makes up more than 15% of global foundry production now, as we had seen through the CG, Japan's government-backed chip-making venture Rapidus is set to launch a prototype production line for 2-nanometer semiconductors by the first half of the 2025. And Intel from the United States is also bidding to enter the market as well. This turned what was a two-way race into a four-party competition. Now, how do you believe the foundry market is going to be restructured, and what strategies should South Korea use to survive in such a market?
Actually, I'm quite surprised because I'm an economist rather than an expert in the semiconductor industry. So anyway, I tried my best to give the answers to your questions. Actually, as far as I'm concerned, that Rapidus is just established in the August last year, 2022. And supposedly they are expected to produce when 2-nanometer process nodes semiconductor by 2027. So in terms of the cycle of the semiconductor, it's quite a long period. So I don't think we have too much concern about the production of 2-nanometer. Actually, this is a very long-term project in light of the semiconductor industry. So as for the South Korea's strategy currently, I'd like to make use of the Andy's comment on the prospect of the semiconductor industry is particularly the geopolitical issues should be a very primary factor our Korean government and our semiconductor industry have to take into account. So the best is keep balance as neutral as possible. That is the advice I would like to make, and that is no other way, no other alternative would be better for the Korean economy. So all other alternatives are, if you lose the balance, always it is very deleterious to the Korean economy. So I believe that the best way is, because as Andy mentioned, the Chinese economy is on the path to recovery sooner or later. That is surely true. And then we have to ride that path together with China. Otherwise, Korea is located between Japan and China, and between China and America, United States. So there is no way for the Korean economy avoid the geopolitical issue. Europe is far away. India and Africa, as their purchasing power is too low. So to that regard, the best one is to keep the balance, and then focus on some recovered economy. And currently, we have to endure some decline of trade, and then we have to improve some domestic economy. I think that is the best way. And then, according to some semiconductor industry cycle, the Samsung and SK Hynix, they have to wait. But within 2 years, the price of the semiconductor will be on the path of recovery.
Right. So considering a geopolitical issue, we need to keep the pace not only with China, but also with the United States. Right. Now, Andy, I'd like to ask you, though lagging far behind, some say that South Korea also need to invest in nurturing the fabless ecosystem, which is semiconductor designing. Now, what is the importance of such a move, and how would investment in such designing affect major chip makers' development in the long term?
Well, this is a very good question, and I think the starting point we can understand the answer is that semiconductors are vital to every part of society and every part of an economy around the world, whether we're talking about consumers, businesses, even the military. So the ability to produce advanced, cost-effective semiconductors, I think, is vital for any country. So when we talk about fabless, I think we're typically referring to the EDA, the software designing part of the semiconductor value chain. So not just the software applications themselves, but designing the chips so they can be then given to a TSMC, a Samsung, or an Intel to actually manufacture. And this, I think, plays to some of South Korea's strengths. You know, I joked a little bit about its cultural power, but certainly creativity, the use of high information, high knowledge type products certainly, I think, would play to South Korea's strengths in addition to its traditional strengths in manufacturing. The last point is, of course, the more you understand more completely the different facets of any kind of manufacturing process, the more likely it is you'll be successful, the more deeply you'll understand customer needs and how to fill those needs efficiently, profitably, and at a high quality. So I think really from almost every perspective I can think of, I think it does make sense to move towards or add a fabless capacity to what South Korea already is doing.
Right, so we do need to extend our boundaries to lead the global chip market. Now, Professor Song, as shifting gears a little bit here, as a central industry, the South Korean government is aiming to give more tax credits for chip investment, 50% for conglomerates and 25% for SMEs. However, whether that will be possible is still up in the air, as it is being very much debated in National Assembly. But what is your opinion on such tax credit policies for the industry, and what other measures do you believe South Korea should come up with to rival and compete with other countries?
I think the current tax credit is a little bit out of the point, and it does not help much. The main reason is because according to the semiconductor cycle, and these big conglomerates who has very strong strengths in the semiconductor production, and they actually this tax credit is just to help them financially to endure such some down cycle of the semiconductor industry. But the problem is whether it has a positive effect in the overall Korean economy. To that regard, I don't think it is a great help to the Korean economy. The main reason is currently today's inflation is driven by the supply shortage, and then there is some interest rate hike. It is combined with some reduction of some fiscal support for the Korean economy. But the fiscal support is aimed for some big companies and the big tech companies. So that is kind of some worst combination of actually that has helped to decline the Korean economy. So that should be in reverse way, because decreasing the interest rate and also fiscal policy for some weaker and the lower and the middle income people. The reason is the primary engine of growth of the economy is consumption, not just supply, not investment. Simply speaking, investment and also supply does not help the corporation to survive as long as there is no consumption. So what is important right now is we have to focus on how to revive the consumption, because the current economic difficulties not originated from some demand reduction or other things. It is because of the supply shortage. Therefore, in order to get the economy back in the normal path and the recovery path, we have to focus on the consumption recovery. That is my point.
All right, we need to focus on consumption for our economy to revive and be successful. All right, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Hopefully, today's discussion with our experts gave a glimpse into the difficulties South Korean chip industry is facing and how it should try to tackle those challenges. Thank you, Professor Song and Andy, of course, for your great insights. We really appreciate them.
It was my pleasure, and good to see you, both of you.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Hope our viewers enjoyed Thursday. We only have a day till the weekend. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories on the issues happening in South Korea and, of course, around the globe. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.